Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Hey Jay, it's been a while since we have done a listener mail show, but that's what we're doing today. So we've got a bunch of listener questions all queued up and ready to go. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do it. We'll start with an email from John, who writes in part, how about exploring military expenditures, comparing and contrasting the view that we need a larger, say, Navy with those asking for a focus on better body armor, or preparing for a traditional war versus more of a series of smaller conflicts. I want to learn what the evidence-based perspectives are from center-right to center-left. My personal perspective is that every dollar spent on a gun is one not spent on our most vulnerable citizens. But I have intelligent, fact-driven friends whose values I largely respect, who help me understand that there are a lot of gray areas in the military expenditures question that I would love hearing explored. Not just to spend or not, but how to spend or where to spend operationally. So, Jay, well, what are your thoughts on that? Military spending, how we should spend it, where we should spend it, or if we're spending too much of it.
Well, I'd say for the conservative answer, are we spending too much? Probably always. In that, do we get the best deal on things? Are things overpriced? There was always there's been that history of our military contracts overpriced, and I think that's part of the beast that you deal with. In large part, I would say, I think our military has become the more mobile, lighter sort of force that it needs to be. And I understand that you and I will differ on the wisdom of some of the wars that we fought, or the military adventures we've been involved in over the last decade or so. But we have pared down from the 80s era Cold War, millions of Russians pouring across the Fulda Gap type vision to a more mobile strike force. Now, and again, it turned out we did need bigger troop strengths in some of these areas. And I think we've sort of accommodated that. But if you look at sort of what the military can do from a precision standpoint, I think we're getting the bang for our buck, and we're still the strongest military in the world. And obviously, we can go back to talk about other things about, do we need to upgrade capacities, and do we have enough carriers, and those types of things. But I think we're doing well there. I would disagree with the premise of every dollar spent on a gun is something that's not directed to social services, because I just don't think that's the case. I think even if you didn't have that military spending, I'm not sure that it necessarily reflects as money that is then spent on some social services. And I'd also say that at least very much in the conservative viewpoint, military expenditures, this is something that people can't be reasonably expected to do themselves, and conservatives view a strong national defense as one of the key places where that is the federal government's job, and ought to be funded to its a healthy extent. Let's not say fullest, but a healthy extent.
Yeah, well, just to be a little more specific as to what we're spending. Defense spending is right around $600 billion. That's not including the stuff that's squirreled away in various other can't be talked about publicly sort of accounts.
Stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's at least $600 billion a year. And to give you a sense of how much that is, kind of in more of a context, that's over half of all discretionary spending in the budget. And also, we are by far the biggest spender on defense. Number two is China at right around $146 billion. So, I mean, we dwarf the next, really. We spend almost as much as the other top 15 countries combined in terms of military spending. So it's a huge, huge difference. And, as to what we're getting from that and whether or not we could spend some of that money better in other ways, I think certainly that there are efficiencies that we could get, and we need to, I feel, I've argued this a number of times before, that we need to reevaluate some of our priorities in terms of spending. And so there's certainly, I would agree with you, Jay, there's not a one-to-one correspondence. Just because we spend $1 less on military doesn't mean we're going to spend $1 more on domestic programs for whomever or whatever. But also it is a limited pie. And given the fact that many Republicans who can be so harsh on cutting spending in so many other ways tend to just want to throw money at the military. I think that's something that we need to take a look at. I certainly think that the United States has a unique role in the world in a military sense, and that's not going to change. And that's probably, I think, a good thing. But I certainly think we could maintain that role, spending considerably less and taking a certain amount of that money and putting it into programs for our neediest, or putting it into programs for infrastructure or economic growth and that sort of thing. Now as to
what I'd point out, though, that when we talk about discretionary spending versus non-discretionary spending, most of the social service programs we're talking about are in that non-discretionary entitlement batch. So I mean, just take that for what you. I'm just saying that to kind of put things in perspective. That while our military spending is sort of discretionary, the social service stuff, I'm talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that is not.
Just to be clear, that's a good point, that the top three things in the budget in its entirety that we spend money on: Social Security, by far the biggest one, Medicare and defense are pretty closely tied, and then Medicaid is, well below that. So yeah, that's a good thing to bring up, certainly. Now, as to more kind of nuts and bolts level of what we should spend on, carriers or body armor, that sort of thing, I'm certainly not qualified to make those kind of decisions, obviously, or don't have the expertise. And I'm guessing, Jay, that's probably outside of your wheelhouse as well.
Yeah, and those are decisions that we depend on people who are really sort of experts in the field, and that's neither our expertise. And these are people who fight the wars and people who look at what wars we're likely to fight and have a very in-depth knowledge of what our current capacities are and current problems are, and that ain't us.
I think, though, one thing,
at least it's not me.
Well, I think one thing we can say is that oftentimes when we talk about military spending, a lot of it focuses on procurement in terms of, manufacturing jobs and so forth, whether it's for fighters or whether it's for, body armor or what have you, because that creates jobs in factories and congressional districts and so forth. There's a lot less focus oftentimes on how we're compensating the people who do this for us and how we care for them after they're done serving, and there have been repeated scandals about, awful treatment in VA centers and huge wait times and so forth. And it makes sense from a political standpoint, because that's not the sort of spending that members of Congress get very excited about, as opposed to, hey, this plant, it's creating parts for a new,
for our district.
Exactly. And so that's been a continuing problem. And just due to the nature of politics, that's unlikely to be, solved certainly anytime soon. All right. Before we move on, we'd like to thank a new sponsor. That's Blue Bottle Coffee. Not too long ago, I made a trip out to my mailbox, and I was actually really excited to see my first delivery of Blue Bottle Coffee, because I'm sort of a coffee snob. I mean, I brew it in this single cup Japanese pour over thing that takes these special filters that are all written in Japanese. Yeah. And of course, I grind my own beans. I've got this Italian burr grinder that costs, let's not, I don't want to think about how much it costs, but anyway.
You're blowing your rep as a man of the people here.
Yeah, there you go. But the point is I know coffee, and Blue Bottle Coffee seriously impressed me. When I opened the box, the first thing I looked for was the roasted on date, because that's a dead giveaway for good coffee. If there's no date listed, or if they only give you one of these best buy dates, that's a bad sign. Now, my Blue Bottle Coffee was roasted just 2 days before it got to me. And I thought, that's better than any coffee I've ever gotten through the mail before. And I've bought a lot of coffee. And the taste was exceptional. I mean, I always try a new coffee plain at first without any creamer or stevia or any other stuff so I can get the kind of the purest possible experience. And this coffee, my Blue Bottle coffee, didn't need anything to taste better than any light roast that I can ever recall having. And the nice thing is that maybe you're not into light roast. That's cool. Blue Bottle has something for everyone's palate. If you don't like those lighter kind of things, they have these seriously deep chocolatey espressos. So, I mean, there's a range of stuff that will suit everyone who loves coffee. And, in the past, I've mentioned how important sustainability is to me. And that's why I think it's great that Blue Bottle works directly with farmers all over the world to source the most delicious and sustainable coffee they can find. And they've got a great deal for Politics Guys listeners. Go to bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG for $10 off your first coffee subscription order. And that's bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG for $10 off. Once more, because third time's a charm, it'll stick in your head this way. bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. Seriously, great stuff. Check it out. Okay, moving on to our next listener mail question. You ready, Jay?
I'm ready.
Okay, we have Matt who writes, "Hey guys, first let me say I really appreciate what you're doing. It's been quite a while since I've heard real political discourse that includes a shared understanding of facts and reality. Here in Canada, the situation is better than the States, but it's still basically a bunch of echo chambers with very few people trying to understand where people outside of their bubble are coming from." So that's a nice way to start. I always worry when they start so nice that maybe we're going to get nailed here. So,
exactly. But
yeah. Here, Matt goes on to say, "Something has been bothering me recently. As someone in tech, I see some of the changes coming right on the horizon, but it seems like they rarely get discussed by policymakers in any real way. We're only a few years away from self-driving cars, and once that happens, the entire transportation industry is going to go the way of mining and manufacturing. Self-driving cars are really just continuing a trend of massively disruptive automation. As a programmer, I actually benefit from this personally, but consider the human cost to so many jobs being eliminated so quickly one of the biggest problems facing our society today. The far left has answers to that. As large segments of the population are put out of work, publicly funded higher education becomes more important since it allows for transitioning into other professions. On top of that, there's the acknowledgement that as a group, we have the resources today to allow for things like public education or even a basic income. The problem is that the vast majority of those resources lie in the bank accounts of a small amount of people who have so much wealth that they will never be able to spend all of it. Apart from that, what would be more centrist takes on the problem? I would see center-left pushing for welfare expansion, but that isn't really an answer that actually works that well, more than just a Band-Aid for a problem that isn't completely inhumane. I'm actually extremely curious as to what the center-right answer would be, since it is hard to have a market-based solution when we are basically talking about the elimination of major markets. Friends I have who lean that way sort of give me I don't know, when I ask them. So, Jay, center right, that's you. What do you think, man?
I will start by confessing my ignorance and sort of saying when I don't know, but qualifying with that's okay. If you were to look at, you go back to New Bedford, Massachusetts in the, say the 1880s or something. This was a huge industry, was the whaling industry. This provided the oil that lit most of the United States, a lot of the world, and it was a huge industry for not just that state and that region, but for the entire country. And almost overnight, that industry vanished, and those people went somewhere else. Now, Thomas Edison saved a lot more whales than Greenpeace will ever. And I think this is one of the things that conservatives look at, that technology and these advances are things that are outside and beyond the control of the government. The good news is that, as we've seen, typically you get more jobs being created than are taken away. There's more spinoff from these new industries than disappear, and they tend to be better jobs, higher paying jobs. So that's like the macroeconomic answer. Can I say specifically what can we do to ease that transition. I don't know. I think education being having the ability to re-educate people to go into new fields is something that's worthwhile, because the new fields necessarily tend to require more education than what's gone before. That wasn't the case, in the 1880s or at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. You could move from one unskilled profession to another unskilled profession. So I think the right would be okay with that sort of thing. But I think there's just a different worldview in that these things can be controlled by the government or changed by the government. I think most folks on the right would say no. This is what happens, and you have to let the market work to create the next big industry. And again, you can look even in the past couple decades of companies that have completely changed what they're doing, how they operate, and to the benefit of I think larger. I mean, Apple used to make computers, and it still does, but its primary revenue is online sales. And that's sort of more of a micro view, but I think you just have to let the market work and do the best you can to predict these changes. Driverless cars, I think, may create a whole new industries, and things we haven't even seen yet. And I think sometimes when you take too many steps to try to balance that, you stop that creation. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, Mike.
Well, I think it's an optimistic answer. And
it was a long answer.
It's no surprise that you are more optimistic about the market's ability to make life better for everyone than I am. I mean, that's why you're on the right and I'm on the left on these things. I think, though, I will say I agree with you that your description of how markets have always worked, or have almost always worked, has been accurate since the Industrial Revolution up until fairly recently. But I think what we're seeing now is a fundamental change in this. Is you can only educate people up so much, and as our machines get smarter and smarter and can do more and more, we find that it becomes increasingly more difficult to create these new jobs for people. And so I do think that this isn't just more of the same. I think we're seeing a very clear disruption point. Now, I
don't disagree that's a big disruption point.
But I think that the traditional answers just won't work anymore. I mean, yeah, traditionally it's been the case that, well, you lose one sector and the market creates another sector. I still think that will happen, but I think that those sectors are going to be technology dominated and not people dominated. And so I think something like a basic income is going to be inevitable, essentially. And for listeners who want to get a better sense of some of this stuff, there are a number of books that I would recommend. Tyler Cowen has written some really not too long and very approachable things. The Great Stagnation is one I highly recommend, or Average is Over is another good one. But there's a lot of stuff, a lot of economists who are looking at this now and who would agree that this is we're entering in a very different period. And where I agree with you on this, Jay, is that we can fall into the danger of reacting too quickly and on too massive a scale, and we don't know exactly how things are going to sort of shake out. But on the other hand, we don't want to be entirely unprepared and just be entirely reactive. So, I think this is just essentially a sea change in the economy and in the work lives of Americans we're going to be seeing from this point on. And I don't know really any good answers, but I think it's going to have to involve at some point something like a basic income, but we will see. All right. Before we get to our next question, we'd like to thank our next sponsor for today's show, Casper. I've told everyone already about my fraught history with mattresses and how it finally ended not too long ago, thankfully, when I got completely fed up and decided to get a Casper mattress. And I can tell you that this is the nicest mattress I've ever owned. And I'm very hard to please when it comes to these things. I'm a very picky kind of person. And getting it incredibly easy. No trip to the mattress store, so no commission-based marked up prices like with so many other mattresses. It's a quick, pleasant online experience, and boom, you get an obsessively engineered mattress at a shockingly fair price. And One of the things I love about Casper's mattress is that it's designed with this combination of supportive memory foams that gives you just the right amount of sink and bounce. So it's not like if you think, well, I'm just going to sink right into this thing. No, not at all the case. Also, it's really breathable, which means it sleeps cool. And that's super important to me because when I sleep, I put off enough heat to like power a small Midwestern town or something like that. So that would be a mattress that slept hot would be a non-starter to me. Not the case here. Now, I hope you believe me about this, but the great thing is you don't have to believe me. Casper has over 20,000 reviews with an average of 4.8 stars, an average. Plus, there's free shipping to the US and Canada and a 100-night risk-free deal. If you don't love it, they will pick it up and refund you everything. So you cannot lose, right? Plus, it's designed, developed, and assembled in the USA, which is nice. And best of all, Politic Skies listeners get $50 toward any mattress purchase by going to casper.com/TPG. That's casper.com/TPG. Terms and conditions apply. All right, moving on to our next question, Jay. Let's see who we have here. We have Chris from Morgantown, West Virginia, who writes, as a moderate, I like to make sure I get voices from both sides of the political aisle when it comes to news, reaction, opinions, and so on. Even if I don't always agree with them on everything, I think it's better to like people from multiple political angles. So my question is, who would both of you recommend that people look up, who you respect, but are on the opposite end of the political spectrum from you? That's a great question.
Wow. That's sort of a tough one. First one, obviously, I'll say Mike. Let's listen to what Mike says on the show. For conservatives, it's a little weird because we're sort of marinated in this, what you call the mainstream media. So it's all out there. But I like Andrew Sullivan, who is, I don't know if you can really classify him as a liberal or how you classify him. He's sort of an iconoclast. But I enjoy him for taking a different perspective. I also think typically the New Republic, just in general, is a good place to start. It's if you're a conservative who wants to get sort of the thoughtful left as opposed to just the angry screaming left. The Atlantic too. I don't know whether, Mike, you'd call them, left wing or not. I don't think they're left wing, but they're certainly sort of mainstream media. Again, there are a lot of things there, without naming individual authors, where I think it's thoughtful stuff that can make you think and challenge you, but it's not just sort of the shouting.
Yeah. I think on that question of the Atlantic, and I would say that would be, I think, a great recommendation. I do think they're left of center. I used to read the New Republic, but I feel like they've gotten a lot more partisan and a lot less thoughtful. They've sort of tried to make themselves stand out. They become more kind of HuffPost-ish, as I
they did have a change of management over the last year or so, I think, and that's made a difference. I think you're right. It's gone from it is more clickbaity than what it used to be.
But the Atlantic, definitely, and for me, there are a number of folks who I would recommend. One is Norman Ornstein, who actually was from the American Enterprise Institute. He's actually been on the show. I interviewed him a while back. Brian Kaplan, he's an...
Although you can't, I don't know, I'll quibble with you in that Norman Ornstein, although he's with AEI, you can't really say he's a conservative. He's sort of the iconoclast of AEI.
Fair enough. All right. Okay. For more real conservatives, then I would say Brian Kaplan's a little more conservative. He's an economist from George Mason, and actually I've interviewed him on the show as well. This one will be people I've interviewed on the show, actually. Tyler Cowen, who's more kind of libertarian. I haven't interviewed him.
It makes sense that you seek out those. We talk to those.
Exactly. One person who I think is great, especially in healthcare, from a conservative standpoint, is Ovik Roy, and he does a great column for Forbes magazine on healthcare, and you can subscribe to it. It's highly recommended. And then I think a couple other people, Bill Kristol from the Weekly Standard. I listen to his podcast. It's the Daily Standard. I think it's for me, that's the one conservative thing I make sure I check out on a really consistent basis because it's a nice, short kind of podcast. They're usually like 10 minutes or so, and it kind of gives me a really strong, well thought out, conservative response to a lot of stuff. So I would definitely recommend the Daily Standard podcast, and Bill Kristol's on it more often than not. And then finally, I'd recommend Rich Lowry from National Review, who I also think is a really sharp conservative thinker.
Good. I'd approve all those choices.
All right, good. Good. Glad to hear it. All right. Let's see here. Let's see. We have Eric here, but you know what? Before we talk about Eric, let's talk about Dollar Shave Club. Dollar Shave Club, of course, is the smarter choice where you can get a great shave at a great price that is conveniently delivered right to your door. Now, Jay, last time we were talking about Dollar Shave Club, you might recall, I suggested that their excellent razor blades and shave butter would be the perfect tool if you wanted to just shave it all off and feel the cool summer breezes against your fully shorn self. So I got to know, are you now fully shorn?
I did not do that.
You are not fully shorn.
I lost the vacation beard.
Okay.
But
well, that's something.
Other than that, I still look sharp and clean cut.
Okay. Well, that's, I guess that might have been kind of radical. Maybe if you were maybe embarking on a master swimming kind of career, you might want to consider that for kind of resistance in the water. But yeah, okay, fair enough. But it would be a perfect tool for that. If you're thinking about doing that, hey, go ahead. And what I love about Dollar Shave Club is you get this great close shave at a great price. And plus, I just think it's super convenient to have blades and that excellent shave butter that's delivered right to your door automatically. That way you don't have to remember to buy blades and shaving cream and go to the store and get all that stuff. And Jay, I know even though you didn't shave your entire body, you certainly shave your beard or what beard you had, and you had a great experience. You have great experiences with Dollar Shave Club, right?
Like again, love Dollar Shave Club. The idea of having to make these extra trips out to, and look, I'll give a little, personal confessional here. When it comes to things like razor blades, my wife doesn't actually buy them for me or do anything like that. She's sort of, well, you're on your own, figure it out. So that means I'd have to make an extra trip, my own trip, out to wherever, the drugstore or the big box or medium-sized box store, to do that. And again, it's one of those things that always kind of grates you when you got to pay the premium price on top of making that extra trip. And Dollar Shave cuts that out. I think you get a great blade, great razor, and super convenient.
Absolutely. And for a limited time, new members get their first month of the Executive Razor with a tube of that Dr. Carver shave butter for only $5 with free shipping. And after that, razors are just a few bucks a month. That's a $15 value for only $5. And in that first month's box, you'll get this great weighty handle, a full cassette that has 4 cartridges, and a tube of that shave butter. And after the first month, replacement cartridges will ship automatically at that regular price. No hidden fees, no commitments, cancel anytime you like, but you're not going to want to cancel. Trust me. You can only get this offer exclusively at dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. That's dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. Okay, on to our next contestant. I was going to say that can't be right? Our next listener.
We should have some sort of a game show.
Yeah, that would be nice. I don't know. Anyway, it's Eric who writes, listening to your episodes as a British citizen, I can speak. I wonder why America, one of the world's richest nations, cannot offer universal health care, but is spending a huge amount of money on it, 27% of the budget, according to this chart he sent me from nationalpriorities.org. How does it have such high costs when a country such as France only has to pay 17% of its budget on health care while having superior health care outcomes to the USA? Why are Americans paying so much for the healthcare for such bad value? As well as this, why is a single payer system so unpopular? In other European countries, saying you dislike universal healthcare is electoral suicide. Why is it okay in the USA? Finally, why are insurers allowed to make a profit? Wouldn't it be better for the government to cover insurance without making a profit? Thank you so much for always providing reasonable content, and a big thanks to Jay for making conservatism great and reasonable again. How about that? That's
Oh, well,
really
thank you.
nice. Yeah. Then he says, Mike, thanks for keeping up the good work at making conservatism accountable. We will hopefully see a Democratic majority in 2018. Amen, Eric, and amen on almost all of your points. I mean, I think you and I are kind of much more eye to eye. Clearly, Jay is not. Jay, why don't you have at it?
Well, I think maybe the difference is, and again, it's a little hard. I can't speak to exactly what the British experience or certainly the French experience is, but in America, there's a strong tradition of I have my own doctor, my healthcare is my own, and I've got my own control over that. And there's resistance to the effect or to the idea of the government being involved in that relationship and making healthcare decisions for you. For example, who your doctor is going to be, when you're going to be treated, that sort of thing. And I think that's just something that is in our DNA that is different than it is in the European cultural DNA. It's we just have more of a tradition of sort of the rugged individualism and keeping the government off your back sort of thing. So I think that's a big part of the resistance to it. The other issue is, as you mentioned, the U.S. already does spend a great deal of money on healthcare in terms of entitlements that have been created, namely Medicare, Medicaid, and then other state benefits. So we do that, but the population of the United States is big and diverse, and in some respects, I think presents more healthcare challenges than European countries. So I think that's the other reason why maybe if you say, well, there's more expenditures for outcomes that aren't as good, and I might quibble with you on the outcomes because that's sort of a big term. I mean, you can say that there are some things that U.S. healthcare does great and better than anyone else in the world, and then there are others that they do not. So I think it's where you're looking in that outcome box. But I think part of it is just the vastness and diversity. I think there was something I read recently that U.S. Medicaid expenditures exceed what the British pay for the national health. So again, we're dealing with kind of just a bigger picture, more people, and it's more complex.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jay, entirely about the cultural aspect. Certainly, that really is I think the fundamental answer to Eric's question. I think I certainly would favor a more European style social welfare system in a lot of ways, but again, as you said, it's not in our DNA. The United States is very different in a lot of ways. And so that is the biggest reason why I think, and we see this in other issues too, like the guns issue, for instance, would be another example. And so we are just kind of different in a lot of ways. Now, as for the outcomes versus spending, I think a biggest part of the problem here is the crazy way our healthcare system was designed, and there are a lot of things to go into, and how tax credits and other things. But basically, if you want an efficient system, I think regardless of what kind of system you're talking about, there are two ways you can go about it. Number one, you can try some sort of top-down sort of thing where one buyer basically has the power to control prices or set prices. And, that's kind of more a model where we see in a lot more European countries. Or you can try a market-based approach where you actually have correctly functioning, transparent, open markets, and that tends to drive down costs and raise quality. That's the problem. We have neither of these things in the United States. I mean, and that's one thing I think you can agree with me on, Jay, is that the healthcare market is not anywhere close to transparent, and prices
exactly. There's you can't really tell what you're paying for, and that would be sort of, I think that's been a piece of a lot of the conservative proposed reforms, is the greater pricing transparency and greater outcome transparency. But right, it's difficult to tell because there are so many intermediaries here between your employer, your insurer, and then your provider.
Exactly. And, so that's, I think, is the problem, is you can go one of these two ways, but we have is just this big kind of hash that's just sort of been developed over time, and that's why we have so much waste and inefficiency in the system, and obviously that's a big deal. This is why this is such a crisis in the United States, because culturally we're not going to go to a single payer Medicare for all type of system. At least I don't see that happening in the near future. But also there's too much resistance to going toward a strictly market-based system, so we kind of muddle along, and that was fine when healthcare was not nearly as technologically sophisticated and expensive, and it was a much smaller percentage of our GDP. But more and more, that's not the case, and and so we're at kind of a crossroads. And what are we going to do? Well, no one knows. That's a huge a huge problem. We have to do something, but God only knows what we're going to end up doing. So it's a big mess, I would say, for certain. So. Now, Eric also has.
We will continue to muddle through that.
Well, we hope so.
And I think, another piece just to throw into that is, in a lot of cases, most people, those who have employer-provided healthcare and good coverage, are pretty happy with their healthcare situation, and that's the issue. Is there are a lot of people who are fairly satisfied and don't want to make a change that could unsettle that.
Right. And that's part of the problem with that, of course, is those people are satisfied because they're dramatically underpaying for what they get, and with that, it's into the whole issue of when consumers don't feel the cost of things, they tend to overindulge in these things. And so now healthcare has some certain limits on that. Just because a doctor's visit is $25 instead of $200 doesn't mean you're going to schedule, 10 doctor visits a week or something like that. But still, it's a dramatically malfunctioning market for a lot of reasons. So, but we are muddling through, and let's hope we can do better than that. But anyway, Eric had this addendum to his email, interesting addendum, where he writes, could you do the 8 values test? It would be cool to see where both of your results lie. Now, I'd never heard of the 8 values test, and Jay, I don't think you had either, right?
No. But anyway, it was new to me, but it was fun.
It's a bunch of questions they ask you about your various views on things. And if you want to take it yourself, it's 8 values. That's the number 8 values, 8 VALUES, at GitHub, GITHUB.io. And you can take the test yourself. So, Jay, we both took this test. Now, my results told me that my closest match in terms of political philosophy was a social liberal. And yours, I believe, said that you were a neoliberal. So I mean,
a neoliberal, yes, and I was a little taken aback by that, but yeah.
although I looked at my results and I said that's pretty much in line with kind of how I am. It said I'm an economic centrist. I'm kind of balanced in terms of the diplomatic axis, what they call. On civil liberties and civil rights, I'm pretty liberal, and on cultural stuff, I'm pretty darn progressive, they call it. So I'd say that's a pretty good indicator of me. And for you, I know on the market thing, it had you being very strongly kind of libertarian on that, which totally
Amen.
Fits, right?
Free mind, and again, I was fairly strong libertarian on some of the social issues and so forth, which might surprise listeners.
Yeah, you were pretty middle of the road there.
Free minds, free markets. That's what I'm all about.
Well, I like what it termed you on what it called the diplomatic axis. They called you patriotic. I thought you'd like that.
Yeah. I appreciate that.
And it also said you were
sort of the patriotic is sort of the nice way. I think the nice term for jingoistic.
Nativist. Yeah. Yeah, I guess you went a little further. They call you outright.
But it's interesting. And I would say for most part, although the neoliberal, the term, I'm not sure that's, if anything, I'm more like paleoliberal. You know what I mean? Classical, Adam Smith kind of liberal, but.
Yeah, but I felt that from what I know about, your views and what I obviously know about my views, that it was I'd say it was a pretty fair indicator. It was kind of fun to take. So anyway, folks, thanks, Eric, for suggesting it. And folks, if you want to try it out, it's 8values.github.io is the web address for taking that. So, all right. I think we have time for at least one more question. Let's make it from Tyler, who writes, Jay keeps coming back to this idea that renewables should live or die entirely in the free market, and that government putting their thumb on the scales in any way is wrong and counterproductive. Fair enough, but shouldn't that also hold for fossil fuels? Fossil fuels have been historically and currently massively subsidized by governments worldwide. And that's not even taking into account the costs of pollution, which will kill millions every year and cost the global economy an estimated $5 trillion a year in unaccounted cost, according to the World Bank. So, Jay, what do you think about that? Should we be subsidizing fossil fuels to the extent that we are, or do you take issue with what Tyler's suggesting?
Yeah, I think we do subsidize, and this is part of the what is often called crony capitalism. That once folks get in there and become sort of the primary source, it's always little bits of you go to the legislature or the executive branch, and there's this, hey, well, this one little tweak in the code here can make us more efficient, and this can help us a little bit. And over the years, those sort of accrete until they've built into a solid competitive advantage. So look, the straight ahead conservative Adam Smith type approach would be no, let's not subsidize either. But to some extent, there are always subsidies built into just the economy. Once one sort of power system becomes the norm, it's sort of the natural way to accommodate that. I mean, it's almost like I talked about the whaling example a little bit ago. That we sort of had subsidies in one form or another for that industry. So yeah, I'm as a pure free market person, I'd be opposed to it. But I'm not sure the best way to alleviate that, other than just sort of shining a light and saying, listen, hey, conservatives, here's money that probably could be better spent otherwise, or could be if we just change this regulation, could open it up to a freer market. But that's why companies pay lots and lots to lobbyists to sort of get them those competitive advantages.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about that? What do you think about the second part of the point that he makes, in that there are these costs, there are these direct costs that we can measure, but there are also, Tyler mentions, what economists call externalities, right? Because we know that certain forms of energy production are cleaner than others. And we know for a fact, regardless of how you feel about climate change or other things, that there are clear damages that people suffer because of certain types of, fossil fuel industries. I don't think there's any reasonable person who could say that there aren't more negative externalities associated with fossil fuels than with renewables. And the question then becomes, well,
I could differ with you on that a little bit, in terms of often when we're talking about, say, the amount of resources, if you want to build a wind-based system, if you were to given the energy density of wind, the amount of turbines you'd have to build, the mining, the infrastructure, the steel to create these, there's a lot of externalities there that aren't factored into typically the energy production, as opposed to that same amount of energy being generated from a coal plant.
Well, I wouldn't say those are externalities, because those are all built into the cost of what's being charged at the moment. The sort of externalities I'm talking about are, what are the longer term effects of generating power in this way? And so,
well, tell that to the dead birds.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, certainly. No, and it's a serious thing. That is obviously
that would be an externality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, I think it's a reasonable question to ask. Is that if you believe, even if you're somewhat skeptical about climate change, I think it's unreasonable that anyone who says that human activity is in no way contributing to climate change, I think they're just at their head in the sand. I know that's not your position, Jay, but then if we know that there are costs associated that we're going to be passing on to future generations, should we make an attempt to account for those costs at present? And that's a reasonable question to ask.
Again, I guess the attempt to account for those costs at present. Again, my problem there gets to be sort of an actuarial question of how do you measure those, and then how do you discount those for what might happen in the future, what might not happen in the future. For example, I think if you went back to 1970 and said, okay, we're going to predict what the externalities, the additional costs are going to be for burning fossil fuels 30, 40 years into the future, and you looked at it and then looked at where we are now, you would say, well, actually, we've done a lot better, and it's a lot cleaner than what we had predicted back then. So you would have ended up overcharging. But
right. Well, I guess I would argue I would certainly agree with your point that it's difficult to price these things out and discount for future technologies and other things like that. But I would also, I think, tend to err on the side of what you might call the precautionary principle, saying that, well, let's make sure if we're going to build this in, which I think we should, that we err on the side of ensuring that, given the fact that we only have this, the one planet at present, although Elon Musk, I guess, is trying to do real hard to get us to Mars or something like that. But given the fact that we only have the one planet, that we probably should err on the side of caution and price this on the higher end to discourage the use of that and encourage the use of other energy sources that aren't likely to make human life much more difficult to live in many parts of the world by say 2100 or so.
Yeah. Well, I would also say, when you say price it differently, what you're really talking about is essentially creating a tax.
Carbon tax. Yep. Used to be a conservative idea.
This is some other money that goes to the government, and I think listeners can make up their own mind whether or not having additional money go to the government does that solve your problem, or does that make your problem worse in the long run? So, well,
and of course, the whole point of the carbon tax, with any tax, at least not with any tax, but when you tax something, people tend to use less of it, and so taxing something is one way to discourage use of something and encourage use of something else, maybe to replace for, which is why one of the reasons, for instance, we have big taxes on cigarettes, which have huge externalities, obviously. And so I see fossil fuels sort of as cigarettes for the environment. And I think we should impose a pretty significant carbon tax. And again, this was an idea that started with, conservatives, or at least was picked up by conservatives in the 80s and the 90s and was conveniently dropped when maybe it became something that might actually happen. But sometimes that's a little bipartisan. Anyway, all right, I think that about does it for this Ask the Politics Guy / listener mail show. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We hope you liked what you heard and that you'll check out today's sponsors. Blue Bottle Coffee. For $10 off your first coffee subscription, go to bluebottlecoffee.com/TPG. Casper, where Politics Guys listeners get $50 toward any mattress purchase by going to casper.com/TPG. And Dollar Shave Club, where new members get their first month of the Executive Razor with the tube of their Dr. Carver shave butter for only $5 with free shipping by going to dollarshaveclub.com/TPG. Listener support's a huge help to us, and we greatly appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our super group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon link. And if you want to support the show without spending one thin dime, hey, you could share this episode with your friends and followers, or pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. And leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also really helps. And if you've got a question, comment, correction, or just want to share a random thought with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. The show is produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Sunday. We hope you'll join us.